Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. The Tibet question has been spoken about quite a lot, especially since the India China standoff started up. Before that, people used to talk about it, but not much. The interest levels weren't there. In any case and scenario, since the interest levels are high, we need to understand what Tibet is all about. What is the Chinese claim on Tibet? And do we have any sort of a hold within that region? To discuss this, I have with me someone really special, an author, a historian, a Tibetologist, Mr. Claude Arpi, who's written so much about Tibet and spoken about Tibet. I thought it would be a great opportunity for us to learn from him. Sir, thank you so much for joining me and
Thank you
giving
for
us
inviting me.
your knowledge and sharing it with us.
Thank you.
So my first question to you is, the Chinese have been adamantly claiming the entire of Tibet, and they did what they did in the 1950s. But just to, get a peek glance into history, because a lot of the agreements that were signed about Tibet are in the shadows. May I request you to kindly tell us where did this whole story begin, and do the Chinese actually have a historical claim on Tibet?
I think it began million years ago when the plate, the subcontinent, collided with Tibet, and Tibet became the highest, the roof of the world. And but I must say that if you look, let's say 1950, when Chinese October 1950, when they enter in eastern Tibet. At that time, Tibet was an independent country, had everything of an independent country. What are the signs of an independent country? Tibet had its own flag, its own army, its own stamps, and Tibet had also, more importantly, its own Ministry of External Affairs. It's called Foreign Bureau, which was dealing directly with Delhi, or sometimes through the political officer in Sikkim from the end of the 19th century. There was an officer posted in Sikkim. His designation was political officer, and he was dealing with Sikkim, Bhutan, Tibet. And he was reporting directly to the Ministry of External Affairs. So the fact that Tibet was running its own foreign affairs, and this till 52, 53, is a proof that Tibet was an independent. But if you go back in history, for centuries, Tibet has been independent and very close to India. First, in 7th, 8th century, the religion of India, the Nalanda tradition, the Buddhism, was introduced in Tibet by the abbot of Nalanda, Shankarakshita, who ordained the first Tibetan monks, the three first Tibetan monks, and later on by Guru Padmasambhav, who's, you could say, is today from Pakistan, but Swat was very much part of India. So he was Indian who helped the bring the foundation of the Tibetan Buddhism. Now, the lamas of Tibet started moving and visiting all the great viharas, the great monasteries of northern India, Nalanda, but also Odantapuri, Vikramasila, and all. And they collected all the works, the sayings of the Buddha, the sutras, and they started translating them into Tibetan. For the purpose, the king in 7th century, Tongtsen Gongpo, sent his prime minister, Tomisambota, and he asked to bring a script and a grammar. Now, I don't have picture with me, but I can give you some pictures showing how this script, the Tibetan script, derived from the Gupta script, which was in use in India at that time. So that minister, Tomisambota, brought that script, and he brought also the grammar. That's explained that when the scholars in the 1930s like Pandita Raula Sankritaya, found all manuscripts in the monastery in Tibet, all Sanskrit, palm leaves. He brought some of them in Bihar, in Patna, and these were translated very easily because the grammar is known to Indian Pandits. They use the same grammar. So apart from this religious and spiritual connotation and contacts, uh, there was extensive trade with Tibet. The entire, what is today Uttarakhand, was trading all the passes in today's Uttarakhand. You have Nitila, Manala, Lipuk Lake, and, or even in Himachal, like Chipkila. There was extensive trade. And actually, all these areas, today we hear about ghost villages in Uttarakhand. These ghost villages have become ghosts because the trade, their raison d'être, their life were the trade with Tibet. And in 1962, after the war, it stopped completely. And these villages the people had to start going to Dehradun or other places or Almora for finding livelihood. So that explains all this ghost village. Now the government has started looking into it finally, and they have a program called the Vibrant Village. They want to repopulate. Of course, it has also, if they repopulate too much, you can get cases like Joshimat. It has to be done in a measured way. But the fact is that people from the Himalayan belt were going every year to Tibet. They had trade marts, and the Tibetan people would come and trade also in the Himalayas. And the monks, whether it's from Ladakh, from Kinnaur, from Spiti, from Sikkim, even from what is today Arunachal Pradesh, like Thong, they used to travel to Tibet, study in Tibet, and come back. So, and similarly, Tibetans wanted to visit the holy place in Bihar where Lord Buddha lived 2,500 years ago. So they would come to India. Now, this extensive exchange happened without any visa or without any certificate showing that you're so and so. Or today we go and show our Aadhaar card and all. There was no such a thing. And if you take the passes, for example, in Sikkim, like Natula and Jelepla, you have every day thousands of mules going to Tibet or coming back from Tibet and exchanges. So this continued till 1950, 51 when the Chinese invaded. I have to say also that it's true that the Chinese had influence in Tibet, a very strong influence, like they could have in Nepal a few years ago with the previous regime, and they may get it again with Mr. Prachanda. I don't know, we'll see about that. But, an influence or a presence is not proof that that country belongs to you. So during the Manchu, during the 19th century, Tibet was facing a very serious issue in their system of governance. Now, it was based on the reincarnation. It means when the Dalai Lama, since the 17th century, since the 5th Dalai Lama, had been the de facto ruler, temporal ruler and spiritual ruler of Tibet. Now, you know that system, one Dalai Lama or any Lama, there were 4,000 reincarnated Lama in Tibet at the time in the 50s. One Lama passed away, his monastery, or if in the case of Dalai Lama, the Tibetan government, it looks for his reincarnation. Usually, the reincarnation comes 2-3 years later, and they start. They look for some prophecies, or in the case of the Dalai Lama, there was a very famous lake, Lamoy Latso, in central Tibet, and Lama would go there, the High Lama. In the case of the present Dalai Lama, the regent of Tibet, Rating Rinpoche went there. He had some vision. He described this vision. He noted them down, and accordingly, they sent delegation, and they found the 14th Dalai Lama in close to the Chinese border, is in what is Qinghai today. So Dalai Lama is reborn, is found, and he is start his education. It means practically, I'm speaking now, I'm not at a religious level, because I am not expert in religious matters, but at the very practical level, at the governance level, it means that the Dalai Lama or any other Lama, there's a gap of 20 years between his time he passed away and the time he is able to rule the countries. So I don't know if the Manchu in 19th century had found the trick, but it is a fact that there was 5 Dalai Lama, the 8th Dalai Lama, 9th Dalai Lama, 10th Dalai Lama, 11th Dalai Lama, and 12th Dalai Lama in 1 century. It means that they never reached majority, and as a matter of fact, there was no Tibetan rule. Tibet was ruled by regents, which are sometimes not very competent, or they don't have the knowledge, especially for the temporal matters, to rule the country. So it's true that China used this period for trying to influence Tibet by posting what they call an hamban, which is a sort of ambassador from the Manchu court, an envoy from the emperor, the Manchu emperor, and he was posted in Lhasa, and he certainly influenced, but it is not a proof that Tibet belonged to China. Now, the British came on the scene, and in 1890 they forced a treaty. They signed it directly, the Manchu. The Tibetan opposed it, and ultimately it led to the youngest band expedition in 1904. But before the youngest band went there in 1904, in 1903, London requested from the Viceroy, Lord Curzon, a report. And he said that the Chinese sovereignty over Tibet is a constitutional fiction. So that was the official position of the British government, who looked more from outside. But the Tibetans were not bothered. You know, the concept of a state came very late. At that time, nobody knew that is, I am a separate state. Especially Tibetans were very isolated politically and geographically, and they didn't bother. But they knew that they were independent. And I mentioned some of the sign of an independent nation. For example, in 1947, Tibetan traveled with a Tibetan passport. We have a copy still of this Tibetan passport, which was accepted by the American government as well as a British government. So that shows that Tibet was an independent. Now, what happened in 1950? Actually, in October 1949, Mao Zedong took over and the communists took control of the entire what is China, the mainland of China. And from the rostrum of Tiananmen Square, he declared that now we are a free country, and he founded the People's Republic of China. That was October of 49. 1 month later, he sent troops in Xinjiang, in what was independent Eastern Turkestan. And with the support of Stalin, and it is something that has never been explained why Stalin gave the green light, to Mao Zedong, they annexed Xinjiang, what was Eastern Turkestan, and came to the gate of India. They came at the gate of south of Kashgar, south of Khotan, and they came where the Aksashin, that plateau of Ladakh, which is part of the Indian territory, that was occupied by China in the mid-50s. They came at the gate by December 49. And on the 31st of December 49, he said, we have three tasks for the next year, the 1950, to liberate Formosa, which is Taiwan, Henan, which is a small island of the coast of Taiwan, and Tibet. But nobody really understood, because at that time, you have to realize that Nehru, after so many years of freedom fighting, wanted peace, and peace was on the top of his agenda. Many letters and report that you can find in the Nehru Memorial is what it's called the Nehru Papers. He said, first priority is world peace, and we should be friends with China. That is the most important. If we brothers, Asian brothers, can find peace, it will be an example for the world. Now, October 1950, China, the PLA, enter Eastern Tibet and so-called liberate Eastern Tibet. Mao Zedong was a great strategist, a great planner, one of the greatest strategists. He planned operation in two parts. One military operation invaded Eastern Tibet. The Chamdo was the capital of Kham province of Eastern Tibet. Take over Chamdo. And because at that time the winter was coming, stop for some time. And the second part of the operation was a so-called diplomatic operation. We will force the Tibetan to sign an agreement and agree that they have always been part of Tibet. So the first part went well. Military operation, they entered on October 7. By October 18 or 19 of 1950, the entire Eastern Tibet was occupied and under the control of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and the communists. So at that time, there was no reaction from the government of India. They sent only two. Later, they said, this is not nice what you have done. Tibet was independent. Why have you done that? And that's all. So, but at that time also, 1 month later, on 7th of November 1950, Sardar Patel, who was the Deputy Prime Minister of India, saw the great strategic importance of the Chinese move, not for the fate of the Tibetan people, not for the fate of their leader, the Dalai Lama, but for the Indian borders. So he wrote that very prophetic letter that you can find everywhere on the net to Nehru, the Prime Minister, and explain in detail the implication of the Chinese arriving on the Tibetan plateau. That is an extremely prophetic letter. And I must say that at that time, during my research, because I've done these 4 volumes on the India-Tibet relation between 1947 and 1962, I found that most of the cabinet colleagues of Nehru were behind Patel. That is, Rajendra Prasad, he was not a colleague because he was a president of India, but also K. Munshi, Rajaji, and others. They understood like Patel, and they wrote to Nehru, but it was absolutely ignored. And also Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who had just left the Congress because of the atrocities in East Pakistan against Hindus, so he had left the cabinet, but he wrote and he spoke in December of 1950 in the parliament in very strong he used very strong words to condemn, and he said that we have to. It's India who is attacked. Not only the Tibetan state is going to be destroyed, but India is losing its border, no? And but Nehru refused to have a cabinet meeting, and very, very unfortunately, Sardar Patel passed away in 15 December 1950. So the whole opposition, which were focused behind Patel, just disappeared. Interestingly, Nehru, in November, when the Tibetan took the issue to the UN, he wrote a long note to the Indian representative in the UN, and he said that he said Tibet was a country verging independence. So he admitted that if he did not admit full independence, but he said verging independence. So he knew also, everyone knew in the ministry also. And the Secretary General of the ministry, Sir Girish Shankar Bajpai, was the most strong supporter of Tibet, understanding all the implication for the Indian border, that India, who had that porous border where for centuries people have been trading or going to the for religious training or going in pilgrimage, all this would be over with the coming down of the communists to what was Nifa or northern Sikkim or even Sikkim, and so that's the position. In India decided, or at least the prime minister decided to close their eyes for the sake of a friendship which had never really existed, because it was one-way friendship. Mao Zedong, as I say, was a strategist. He didn't care for. He was not a sentimental leader. That's what opposed so much the Chinese and the Indian leadership at that time. So that's very briefly what has happened. And in the following years, we can come to it later, but slowly the situation deteriorated in Tibet.
It's a sad story, and but sir, there's some questions that do arise with regards to what you said. You've given actually a very clear background of the history and how both the countries, especially in India and Tibet, used to have a very open relationship, if I may say that. Uh, they were cross movements, there was exchange of ideas and religion and culture and so on and so forth. Uh, the big question that actually arises now, you said that the Chinese took advantage of that gap that the Tibetans have had in their leadership. Now, did that gap actually make the Tibetan, whoever was controlling Tibet at that time, not realize the Chinese threat and get their armed forces or whatever forces they had in order to face the threat? Was there any battle that took place, any fight, or any resistance that happened, sir?
I think, interestingly, that I mentioned 5 Dalai Lama, but the following, the 13th Dalai Lama, the previous one, was a great leader. And he realized the importance of that Tibet being independent. And unfortunately, he had to fight against the conservatism of the big monastery, who wanted to remain isolated, who didn't want any contact. And the 13th Dalai Lama, around 1920, he tried to join the League of Nations. He wanted Tibet to also join, but it was opposed. He also tried to bring British schools, not by love of the British, but you know that people get to know what's going on outside. So because Tibet was so isolated, and particularly the big monastery, we had up to 9,000 monks, 8,000 monks. These they didn't know at all what was going on outside, and only a very small elite who had been educated in Kalimpong or in Darjeeling were aware that the world is changing all that there's a movement for independence. It's very strange. If you look at the case of Tibet, no, in the 40s, there was a struggle for freedom in Asia or in Africa. Every country wants to become independent. Uh, they were under the slavery of the British or the Dutch or the French, and they wanted to get independence. So all the African countries slowly, including in North Africa, the former French colony. I mean, India is one of the most important case. Everyone fought and got their independence. Now Tibet was independent, and Tibet lost its independence. And not only that, but none of the newly independent country, either African or Asian or Indonesia, they were ready to fight for Tibet. So I've written a small book called The Karma of Tibet. I don't know what it is, but the fact is that at the end, by 1950, most of the African and Asian states were independent, and Tibet became under the boots of the Chinese army, of the communists. So with very serious consequence for the border, consequence that we still see today. I mean, in Yangtze or in Ladakh. So it's not something which is over. No, it's something which is still we are going through, and it's not over. I don't think it's over. So the 13th Dalai Lama was a very powerful leader. He started training an army. He started a relation, even if the monastery opposed it. He started having a relation. He sent even some Tibetan students in England, in Rugby, to study like mining and engineering and all, to make Tibet a very modern country. He passed away in 1933. And that was the end, because by the Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, took over as a temporal leader only in November 1950 at the age of 15. So it raised also the question, can a boy at the age of 15 can rule a state? That 14th Dalai Lama has been very remarkable Dalai Lama. Somehow he managed, at the age of 19, in 1954, he went to Beijing for several months, and he negotiated with Mao Zedong. But negotiating with China, it's very difficult, and it's, I would say, nearly impossible when you don't have a strong muscles. And India has done the experience in Ladakh now since May 2020. And unless you mass the same amount of troops than them, and unless you're ready to do for some special operation and to counter them, or in the case of Galwan or Yangtze, you're really ready to push them back, you can't deal with China, you can't negotiate with China. So in 1951, some Tibetan were actually prisoner of war. The Nabe, the governor of Kham, was taken to Beijing, and he was made the head of the negotiating delegation, and he was forced to sign the 17 points agreement in May 51, in which it is said that Tibet finally returned to the motherland. But the first article of the 17. But even if you take that article, the fact that you return to the motherland means you were not in so-called motherland before. So that treaty also says that the Dalai Lama's role and all his power will not be changed. But once the PLA started occupying Tibet, once they start making roads in Tibet, roads to the border, into Chumbi Valley towards Sikkim, or later on the Aksai Chin Road, or the road to the Nifa to Tsona or to the Loit Valley, uh, the game was over. And so, the passing away of the 13th Dalai Lama in 1933 was a great tragedy, and it took too much time for the present Dalai Lama was once again, I say, very remarkable, but at that young age, it's not easy to deal with people like Mao Zedong, especially when he was not, he didn't receive any support from India, except when he crossed the border on 31st March 1959, when Prime Minister Nehru said that you're a welcome guest in India and we will provide you support for your education and rehabilitation, but we will not give any support for your political struggle. That was a condition when he crossed the border. And still then, India has provided a lot of help for the Tibetan. They are a very educated lot, and people say they are the most well-off refugees. They are doing well because of that support of the government. But on the political side, nothing has come. India has been the loser because India has lost a peaceful border. And actually, it's interesting if you look at all this period, some of the officers were quite courageous and they tried to tell the government. There was one, Mr. Shumul Sinha, who was the head of the Indian mission in Lhasa till 1952. And he wrote a very strong note for the Ministry of External Affairs. At that time, the Prime Minister was also minister. And he said that we will have trouble in Nifa. Please do something, realize that we will have trouble. And this note was rejected when, like all the other people who objected to the fact that Tibet, India was losing a border, because nobody believed till October 1962. John Dalby, the brigade commander on the Namkachu in north of Tawang, was told the morning of October 20th, Chinese start coming down the Tagla Ridge. And he told his commander, General Niranjan Prasad, they are coming like ants. And he was told, you don't know, we have orders from Delhi, we know that they will not attack. And the order from Delhi was from Krishna Menon, the defense minister. So till the last day, they will not attack. That was at 5 o'clock in the morning, but by 9:30, 10 in the morning, all the Indian positions were put aside, especially on the Namkachu River. So, and the brigade was just finished, no? And John Dalby was captured. So, till the last minute, there was some people in the government. It doesn't mean everybody, but few people who really believe that Chinese will not attack. Chinese are our friends. That the tragedy. But now, 60 years later, what to do? It's not now. Things have changed. Government is standing to China, but big opportunity has been lost.
Indeed, sir, and as a matter of fact, it is that the ghost of 62 that keeps haunting the discussions within India with regards to the India-China relations. It's always, taken back to the 62 conflict, wherein there have been more conflicts after that where India has actually done better than what we did in 62. But anyways, so my question to you is again about, I'd like to take us back to John Husband's mission. That has been considered to be a turning point. The Husband mission is within the region. Was it really so, sir?
The
Husband mission into,
It was a turning point, you said.
yes, sir. Was it really a turning point? What did
You
it
see,
really?
the British wanted to trade with Tibet.
Yeah.
British are traders. They wanted to trade, and Tibetan was refusing to even open the letter of the viceroy or things like that. So at the same time, Curzon, viceroy, and others in London thought that it is constitutional fiction. So they said we will just go. So young husband went. What is interesting in, I mean, the north of Sikkim, the Tibetan army, very weak army, was smashed. So and they advanced to Gyanse. There was another battle, and to Lhasa. They arrived in Lhasa very quickly. And what is interesting is that in Lhasa they signed a convention in 1904 convention between British India and Tibet. So it was the first time that a foreign power signed a convention with Tibet and accepted that Tibet was had the power to sign. And during the ceremonies, we don't have photos, but we have there was some cartoonist from the Life magazine who was with young husband. He has done very nice sketches of the ceremony of young husband in the Potala signing with the regent because the 13th Dalai Lama had escaped to Mongolia by that time. So the Chinese Hamban, I mentioned the Chinese ambassador from the Manchu court was there, but he didn't object. He didn't say anything. So the 1904 was convention was signed, but China progressively started complaining about it and tried to change it. They changed it in 1906, and China also was very worried of the Russian advance in Tibet. And so till 1910, nothing much happened. But for the first time in 1910, the warlord of Sichuan started entering the Indian territory of Nifa in Loit sector, in the Loit Valley, and they went down up to Wallong, which saw the very famous battle in 1962. Because you said that India did very poorly in 1962, but it's not completely true.
Yeah.
India, in many places, I was recently in Rezangla. I mean, it's so remarkable what the Kumaon regiment did, 13 Kumaon did there. In Wallong also, the Kumaon was there, the Dogra was there, the Sikh regiment was there. They fought so well. But China and maybe the West, people like Neville Maxwell have tried to forget that many of the Indian troops fought very, very well during that some of this battle in 1962.
As a matter of fact, when I
So
say that
anyway,
India did do well, it's the leadership and the political part of it. The soldiers are last man, last bullet. And that's been the tradition of India. That is something which is unbelievable. The kind of battles that we read about, Rizangla, is of course is an eye opener of a battle, sir. So you're absolutely right. But my
I was
question,
very blessed to visit Rezangla and to see this place by myself. Anyway, in 1910, the Chinese enter and went down as far down Wallong, which is 40, 50 kilometers from the McMahon line. And at that time, there is no McMahon line. So, but they put a pillar saying Chinese territory. When the British discovered, they removed that pillar and put it near Kibutu, which is today the first village in
yeah,
India when you cross. Now, the British, not only in Delhi, but in London, also realized that there's a danger. Uh, China wants to claim these areas. So they decided ultimately to have a conference in Chimla and bring together on the same table at the same level the Sir Henry McMahon, the Foreign Secretary of British India, the delegate from China, the Ivan Chen, the plenipotentiary of China, and the plenipotentiary of Tibet, Lochen Chatra, the prime minister. So for 6 months they sat together. And if you look at all the proceeding, it's available in the National Archive or many places. I think most of these things are on my website also. I have two websites, but one which is just for the border, the boundary with Tibet. I always call boundary with Tibet, not boundary with China. Anyway, if you look at this proceeding, you see that these three ambassadors are at the same level. For 6 months, China never objected to that. So that's an important point. So ultimately, the difference of opinion between Tibet and China was about the border, their own border. It was not about the southern border between British India and Tibet, which became the McMahon Line in March of 1914. Chinese were not even invited to discuss that border, and they were not interested. Their only interest was where is the border in eastern Tibet. So there are maps of different perception. Now we call it everything perception, but Tibet had a perception far east. It included all the area who speak Tibetan, no? Dege and Litang, Batang, all this area. While the Chinese wanted it much more west, that border. So, and over the century, that border had been fluctuating. So the disagreement and the reason why China, nationalist China, just initial the convention, the Shimla Convention, was that difference of perception on the eastern part of Tibet. But it was not about at all about the McMahon Line. That they didn't care, and they were not really concerned about it. So after that, of course, the British, the war started just after, and the British also didn't show too much concern in occupying this area. It's only in 1951, in February, that Major Bob Ketting and the Assam Rifle went and took over the administration, because for the British it was a lot of expenses, and they were not sure what advantages they could have from occupying or from administrating these places. So they call it unadministrated areas. So they would go what they call a promenade, or they would go for an expedition, a mission, from time every few years, go there and come back. That is for the entire NIFA, but not administrating. But I think I should mention that Sardar Patel, before he passed away in December 1950, he created a committee called the Himat Singhji Committee. Himat Singhji was Deputy RM, Deputy Defense Minister, and he had taken people from IB, from External Affairs, from Army, from Air Force, from different stakeholders, and sent them to this border area. That committee was called Committee for Northern and Northeastern Border of India. And they immediately decided that Tawang should be taken over, the administration should be taken over. And it explained that the governor of Assam, Daulat Ram, was told, you send an expedition with Bob Ketting. It went very smoothly, and Bob Ketting was received as more as a liberator than an invader. So that's quite remarkable. That's explained that today Tawang is part of India. And I was very happy in last month when soon after the December 7, when the Chinese tried to occupy Yangtze, the corps commander and the army authorities put a statue of Bob Ketting at 16,000 feet in Yangtze, because without the Bob Ketting was quite a remarkable officer. He became ambassador in Burma later on in his life, but he was quite a remarkable person. And without firing, without killing anybody, he just took over and started administrating in a much better way that Tibetan had done when they were doing it, because they were just taking money from the local monpas and from the monastery, and he put in place a more democratic and secular
Mm.
administration. And I think the monpa today are very grateful for what Bob Keating did in 1951.
Matter of fact, they were called these monastery taxes, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, monastic tax, like, you know, I live in Pondicherry, and there are churches. These churches, they gave that, they send some money to Vatican. It doesn't mean that Vatican is the owner of Pondicherry, or Goa or other places like that. So some of the monastery, I mean, mainly the main monastery in Tawang, was sending some money to the Lo Suling Monastery, Repong Lo Suling Monastery in Tibet for a long time. And it was collected more or less by force, but there was an affiliation. It's a religious affiliation. It has nothing to do with the
And
ownership of the place. Dalai Lama has been very clear on that. That after 1914, there was a delineation of the border, which is called the McMahon Line,
yeah.
and that was it. South of the line. Now, the fact that the line is not very precise in many places is another matter, and it's also what triggers incident like Samdorongchu in 1986, or Yangtze, or even Kenzimane. So many of these places are not fully, because at that time of the survey in 1913, the equipment and the way of surveying were not as precise as they are today. And that resulted in lying. And at that time, nobody realized that it could be a problem in the future, no? But it became because there was a new neighbor. India had a new neighbor.
Indeed.
And then Mr. Doje Kandu, sorry, Pema Kandu, the chief minister of Arunachal, said, "I have no border with China. I have only border with Tibet," which is very true. But when Tibet was administrating its own border, there were disputes here and there. There's some cases of dispute
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
border, like one in Uttarakhand, today Uttarakhand, in the place called Nilang and Jadong. But these disputes were discussed years after years, and modus operandi was found, and there is no question of a war. Not only no question of a war, but there's no question even of posting
Armed forces.
ITBP, or not even armed force, police
Yeah.
force. So that's new neighbor came, very aggressive, wanted always to extend its territory. If you look at the entire history of the Ladakh, how they have advanced years after years after years. You know, in 1962, there was one of the main battle was Siribjap. And Siribjap is located 10, 15 kilometers east of
Yeah.
the Fingers, where the battle took place
Konark
in,
Fort.
in Kunal was very much part of India.
India.
So this finger area were very much part, and there was no discussion about it. But slowly, also because India's own mistake, in the sense that India has never asked for a map of the LAC. India signed some agreement with China in 93, 96, 2005, 2010. All these agreements mention a LAC. But where is the LAC?
No
When you
one
sign
knows.
an agreement, you should attach a map of this. If you pass a law in the Lok Sabha and it's about a particular topic, the preamble of the law define the topic. Now you have an agreement with China about the LAC without defining the LAC. So it's what we call gray zone today, that China will use it. So actually, what is happening in Ladakh, even some area have not been defined, but it's for the first time the definition of some areas have been put on the map.
It's
And
happened,
during
yes.
the 17 round of talks, that has been very great progress, according to me. Of course, China is not going to give up immediately on Demchok or Depsang, but some of the area, Gavan and Hot Spring and Godar, they have been now maps have been exchanged for the first time, because one time in 2003 some maps were exchanged when there were expert committee meeting from both sides, and after 20 minutes they were withdrawn because both parties saw that there was too much huge difference. I think
So
I've
this, the
I've
last
talked
point,
too much. Huh? I
the
think
last,
I've. Huh? Last question. Yeah.
no, the
Yeah.
last point that you mentioned, sir, is the most important thing that India, a lot of commentators in India refuse to understand. Is that this is the first time between both the countries there has been an exchange and a setting of a map of some kind, let's say in a total span of 100 kilometers, but something has happened which has not happened in the past 75 years. And that's something that you brought out very, very beautifully. Thank you so much for that, sir.
I
Uh,
want to add that I think we should give the credit to the army. I mean, to the government who delegated to the army. You see, army man knows meaning of 50 meters or 100 meters. Sometime in the past, and I could speak a lot about that, but in the Ministry of External Affairs, you deal with maps most of the people have never seen. And what was extraordinary in the Imatriji committee in 1950, 51 was at that time the RM had designated a person from the Air Force, from the Army, from the IB, from different, and the Ministry of External Affairs. You need, in today's world, you cannot have delegate everything to negotiate to the Ministry of External Affairs, because some people know better the terrain, like the army. They should be involved. The intelligence agency should be involved. The Air Force should be involved. And it's what has happened in Ladakh in some, I mean, not fully successfully because it's not over, but during 17 round of talk, that process has taken place, and actually the one additional secretary from the Ministry of External Affairs used to attend all these 17 meetings.
mhm.
So that's a good way forward, and one time it could be eventually duplicated for the eastern
Next, other
sector,
places.
but it will take time.
Absolutely,
Thank you.
absolutely, sir. Absolutely. As a matter of fact,
Thank
you
you.
brought these points out very, very beautifully, sir. Thank you so much for this talk. I'm going to be troubling you for the next part from the 50s to the 70s. I'd like to tell all the viewers and all the audience that will be watching the show. We will cover the 50s and the 70s, where we will talk about the mistakes that India made during the 62, and of course, post 62, what could have been done better to kind of get the situation a little more control. Sir, I'd like to thank you. You've been an eye opener with
Thank you.
regards to the history, and especially the last part of it, which amazingly a lot of commentators don't understand. And the way you brought it out with the context to history is something that needs to be understood. I hope and pray that thousands and thousands of people watch this show so that they understand before they actually the next time comment on the border of India and China. Thank you so much for the story of Tibet and the details that you've brought into it. I will be sure to put up your website on the link in the at the website link in the description, so more and more people can get educated with regards to what you write. Beautiful books and papers and articles and so on and so forth. Thank you once again, sir, and see you next time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.